I'm gonna stop you for one moment.
Yes, yes.
Because the key to Roy and your longevity is cut in half by a trip to New York. And I think we should talk about that before we really talk about Roy. You leave Roy, the office, from 55 to 57. You travel to New York to work for Elizabeth Gordon, who puts you on assignment, and you find yourself in Frank Lloyd Wright's house.
That's correct. That all came about because I had done a house for Herbert and Minerva Kunzel, which now is on the historic whatever they call it, historic designation. And Minerva Kunzel was a very remarkable woman, as was Herbert. He was wise enough and kind enough and thoughtful enough to just let her do the house. And she had lived in Japan for a while with her grandmother as a child and had a great admiration for things Asian. And so through an editor up in San Francisco in Sunset Magazine, got a wonderful architectural photographer to come and photograph the Kunzel house on speculation. Very rare that this man never did it except once for me, for this woman. And a lot of very good pictures were made. And they were sent to Elizabeth Gordon, the editor of House Beautiful magazine. Now I'll distract myself for just a minute. House Beautiful in those days was a very good magazine. In fact, magazines then were better than they are now, in my opinion. And Elizabeth Gordon was one of the finest editors of magazines of that kind that there were. And she took to the house immediately, the art director made all the dummies, which are the blocking out of the pages. And she came to California for another reason, which is interesting, but I'm not going to take the time to tell it. It doesn't affect me so much. But she was up in Los Angeles. And I went up there to meet her. And she said, I want to come to La Jolla or San Diego and meet this Minerva Kunzel and see the house. So she came down with the architectural editor, two of them, and I introduced her to Minerva, and we saw the house. And then she was sitting in the car waiting for this man, to pay the hotel bill where they were staying, and getting ready to go to the airport and fly back to New York. So I was explaining to her, it's a hard way to getting around it. You realize I'm getting there sooner or later. Anyway, we were sitting in the car and I was explaining to her about trying to get a Fulbright. Well, she said, you've just gotten your practice started and you've got a lot of work and you're doing wonderful work. Why do you want to give it all up? I said, I don't want to. I just wanted to go for a year because I'm a real hick from San Diego, or Los Angeles, if you please. I've never been further east than Denver, Colorado. And I want to see something of the world before I'm too old and my children are too grown. I have to put them in college and have other responsibilities, but I can go now. She said, well, how are you doing? I said, well, they're not giving Fulbrights to architects. That was period. They'd given 2 or something. So she looked at me and sitting in the back seat of the car like this, side by side. She said, Robert, or Bob, she called me, if you'll come to work for me for 2 years, I'll see that you see America in a way you couldn't see it any other way. You'll meet everybody in our profession, in your profession. You'll see all the best things there are in the country. And she said, you'll be halfway to Europe. So I said, you've got a deal. Right there. She said, well, how about your wife? I said, my wife's from Connecticut. She'll just be going home. And she said, well, your partner? I said, my partner and I have made arrangements with each other to do this in case it happens. Just happening a little sooner than I'd expected. So 3 months later, I'm in New York City working for House Beautiful as building editor. And this is what Keith wanted me to get around to. The first thing we did was to visit with Frank Lloyd Wright because Elizabeth Gordon planned to publish the first and now only complete full month's coverage of any of Frank Lloyd Wright's work. And it was a great opportunity. She'd gotten all the arrangements made with Mr. Wright. And when I got to New York, the first thing we did was to go up to Taliesin East, which is in Spring Green, Wisconsin, and meet the Wrights. And we stayed there a whole week, lunch and dinner with them and their guests. They had all kinds of marvelous people come visit. And I got to sit and talk to Mr. Wright, the 3 or 4 of us at a time, for a whole week. We went back to New York, and 2 weeks later, we went back for another week. I had 2 weeks with Frank Lloyd Wright and his wife, Olga Vanna. Now, any of you know about Mr. Wright and Olga Vanna, you recognize that she was, I guess, his 3rd mistress. I don't think they ever married. They may have married, I don't know. But the experience of being with that man, in the first place, he was very, very polite and kind to us because we were doing something for him that nobody else ever done and that he couldn't buy. So he was courteous and nice. But my impression of him was that he had, people referred to his ego. I say he knew who he was and what he could do and what he was worth, and he lived that way. Now, if that's in the outward manifestation of that is exhibiting an ego, I guess that's what it is. But my impression of him was a little different as I've expressed it to you. Now, I'd like to tell you about my meeting with him. We got to Taliesin about 3 o'clock in the afternoon, and I was taken to my room, which was down in the house, right underneath Mr. and Mrs. Wright's bedroom. They were right upstairs. And we were to meet at 6 o'clock in the living room for cocktails and then have dinner. So as I went upstairs, after having had a nap, I got to the stairs, went upstairs, and standing in the hall were Mr. and Mrs. Wright, one or two of the members of the fellowship, my boss, Elizabeth Gordon, and the architectural editor, John Hill. So I went and was introduced to Mr. and Mrs. Wright and the apprentice. And Mr. Wright said to me, "Son," he saw me, "son, come into the living room and tell me about yourself." So I went in and I said, well, there was my boss in California, or here in San Diego, Myron Hunt was a distinguished architect of himself. He was the architect for the Henry Huntington House and now Gallery. He was the architect for the Rose Bowl. He designed the Ambassador Hotel in Los Angeles and the Huntington Hospital in Pasadena. A lot of Occidental College. So he was a distinguished architect, and he had been, along with Irving Gill, who many of you will know about here in San Diego, had been in an atelier that Wright had started in Chicago of about 20 young architects who were to get together and form. Wright was great in forming groups. He loved to form groups and then run them. He was good at that. But these two were there, but they came to California in 1898. Gill to San Diego and Myron Hunt to Pasadena.